just turn up and spoil your paper. Because the problem is that I think people just don't turn up because they can't be bothered. And I think that that's a dangerous path to go down. Our democracy is hugely vulnerable. We've already got absence of democracy in parts of Europe at the moment. It's not that difficult for it to tip over into autocracy. We need to be very, very, very protective of our democracy, and that involves every single person in the country exercising their right to vote. But I hear what you say, John, about PCC.
Can I just comment? The 533 people, in my experience of local council elections, etc., way out of proportion, and do we not, as a government, the Conservative Party can be a government, do we not accept that those people were deliberately making protests against the procedures and basic government policy?
Yes, they were, but it was in our manifesto. So people voted in 2010, and PCC was in the manifesto. Now, maybe those 535 people didn't vote Conservative, but it was in our manifesto. What wasn't was November, which I think was pretty dreadful, and AV, which I think was pretty dreadful. But I'm sorry, we're not Conservative government, we're a coalition government. We have to make compromises.
Dr. Lee. My name's Ray Dixon. My wife and I have both been in contact with you over the years by email about the democratic deficit with respect to the EU. And prior to your election, we spoke to you on the doorstep about that, and our disquiet with the way our Parliament had less and less influence over the laws that were passed in this country. And we particularly thought that if the government policy, which is to try to renegotiate and regain control over some things such as fisheries and so on, back in the EU, we think that is currently rather weak, because they would be going to 27 other countries and trying to persuade them to do something which in many cases would be to their detriment. And we're asking them to do that. But we haven't got any leverage, and we feel that if there was a referendum held in this country, and if, as all the polls suggest, the majority would vote to depart from the EU, then that would give a very strong hand to Campbell when he goes and talks to these other countries to say, well, if you don't like it, then we'll get out and you won't have our net contribution. Now, I know you're supporting the government's line because we've had your responses. Can you explain why, please?
Okay. Right, we're not to start with Europe. Okay. With reference to the position that we took prior to the election, I must stress again, we're in coalition. We're in coalition with the most pro-European party in British politics. And so the idea that we've got much room for manoeuvre with the Liberal Democrats, it's not so straightforward, unfortunately. But where I would agree with you is that the need for democracy in this has long been overdue. I don't know how many people in the room here are over 54, but you're the lucky ones because you got to vote last time round. Anyone who's under 54 in this room didn't. Has never had a vote or a direct say on our relationship with Europe. And indeed, those who did have the vote thought they were voting to join a common marketplace. They didn't think they were voting to join essentially a socio-economic sort of model of, very French, that was said, a model of government. And so we're in this situation now at a time of crisis in Europe in terms of its economy, particularly in the Mediterranean, though I thought the front cover of The Economist last week, sort of, I don't know if you saw it, but the French sticks in a bag with a fuse coming out, basically saying the French are next in terms of they may blow up the European ideal. I think that times have changed. Europe's in distress economically. And so at this point you have to ask yourself, well, what's in our best interest as a country? it is there you find that some people, their position slightly changes. I would challenge you actually on what the likely outcome of a referendum at the moment would be. A friend of mine was speaking with a senior member of the press for a newspaper, I can't say who, a newspaper you would expect to come out in a referendum campaign in favour of leaving Europe, who said no, the newspaper will not come out in favour of leaving Europe. And I found that quite surprising, considering the newspaper concerned. So I'm not so sure that necessarily that once you've got members of the papers in Fleet Street, BBC, and some big businesses putting out stuff, that it's necessarily going to be as quick as you think in a yes no referendum, which is why I don't support it at the moment. I do, however, want us to actively renegotiate our relationship with Europe, and in order to do that, you have to have it in your back pocket. You're going to say to France, to Germany, look, if you don't give us this, we're going to have a yes/no referendum on leaving. Because unless you go into a negotiation with something strong behind you, they're not going to give it to us. I'd actually suggest that they're not going to give it to us anyway. And so, but I think it is better that you go through the process of trying to secure that common fisheries policy. The common agricultural policy is a moral disgrace, let alone being an economic disgrace. And we wonder why we have to keep pouring money, international development money, into sub-Saharan Africa. It's because the farmers there can't actually export food into Europe because we're busy subsidising French farmers to produce food we don't need. I mean, it's a moral disgrace, let alone being economically stupid. And it's 27% of the European, what we're negotiating at the moment, 27% of that trillion euros is just on the common agricultural policy. So I'm sceptical. I actually think there's a distinct possibility that we will leave in my political career in the current circumstances because they seem to be going in a certain direction. And the sort of instincts of the British at the moment are, well, no, that doesn't make any sense. Also, our trade with the European Union in relation to the rest of the country, rest of the world, is diminishing slowly. We're down to 43% of our trade is European Union, the rest of it's the rest of the world. It's to the Chinas and the places we need to fight it. And so things are changing, and I think you're going to have a referendum at some point. But I think if you want to win that referendum, as in for you would be to leave, I would wait, and I would keep the powder dry, which is why I didn't vote last week, or whatever it was on the last rebellion. Also, because why rebel on something that made no difference? He's still going to be going into his talks now, and he's not going to get any different deal on that rebellion. That rebellion, for me, if I'm going to rebel once on rules reform, and we stopped it. So it was worth doing. If you're going to rebel, I'm a Conservative member of Parliament, and so I'm not the party of one. I can't, I'm there because I'm a member of the Conservative Party. I don't lose sight of that, so I'm loyal. But you have to get your dominoes in the line, I think. And personally, the new generation are sceptical. Be pleased, sir. Out of 147 UMPs, I count one hand who are actually pro-European. The great majority of them are sceptical because they've grown up looking at it thinking, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't seem to make any sense. And so time will play out. But I think at the moment, we go for renegotiation, not leaving. I hope I've been clear enough. It's difficult to be clear in Europe, but I hope I've given you some sense of where I am.
Can I just say, you seem to make reference to time. You're talking about airports at the moment. Airports and things.
The airport is the sound of the camera. It's on.
It's on. I mean, we've been talking about this airport development for many years now. In 1992, I moved to Hong Kong. We were talking about having a new airport in Hong Kong when I arrived. When I left in 1997, it was just opening. So it was 5 years talking about it to doing it. I've been flying around Heathrow in the past, not now, I'm retired. But I was flying around it hour after hour, 20 years ago. We're still talking about it. I mean, it's disgusting. No wonder we're falling behind Asia, I've lived in Asia, I've worked in Asia, I've worked in the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, everything just takes so long in this country, it's just ridiculous. I don't personally agree when it comes to the police issue, that it's a matter of timing. I think so many people are just fed up with watching a bunch of politicians, and I am a conservative by the way, that you seem to talk and talk and talk. You don't get on and do things. And frankly, if you live in Asia and work in Asia, we're the laughing stock of the world because we are just so slow to do anything.
Okay.
Heathrow has got the land mass, it's had the land there for a third runway since it was conceived. It's there, it's north of the Bath Road, there's no reason geographically thousands upon thousands of people could transit London, would like to transit London, our airports are inefficient. Why is it taking so long?
Okay. Well, actually, it's to do with our planning laws. I mean, Temple 5 took 8 years just to clear planning. And maybe some of this is to do with population density. There is that NIMBY-ish attitude that the English, and I'm probably no different, have in terms of big developments and airports and railway lines and things. But it is the difficulty of having so many people living in a certain area. It is also the challenge of democracy. So the Chinese can do it because they just do it and solve anyone else. And they're certainly not the landowner or anything else. They just get on with it and build it because they're autocracies and they're not democracies. And so we can't really compete with countries like that. But in that regard, but you're right, we don't do strategy. In fact, in 2.5 years of being in Whitehall and Westminster, if there's one thing that stands out of mine is the absence of strategic thinking. It's incredibly short-termist. I don't understand why we do this. We're doing it over energy at the moment as well. Energy policy doesn't appear to have much strategy behind it. And yes, transport. I think there has to be a cultural change within Whitehall. It's very risk averse, it needs to change. But I also think we need to change planning laws, which we are doing at the moment, in order to make these big national strategic assets easier to build. Now that is actually going to upset people because they will see that their rights will diminish over being able to object. But it has to be like that if we're not going to have this silly situation where, as you rightly say, we've got to wait 10 years for this, 10 years for that. Actually, you can build an airport, get on with it, a few years, just get on with it. I was on a select committee the other day, and nuclear power. And there's I don't know if you might not have noticed it, but Hitachi has just made a commitment in the nuclear power sector. And they have a nuclear reactor, and they have to pass something called GDA, which is essentially, is it safe or not? With a straight face, people in front of us said, yes, if we're lucky, we can get it through in 5 years. It was almost like they were really pleased with themselves that they can actually sign off this reactor in 5 years to be safe to be built. So if I make a decision that as an advice secretary I was buying it, I'd have 5 years before I could actually, first brick was laid. Just because they've got to go through the process of making it. I'm sorry, but 5 years, 5 months perhaps, 5 years, but it seems to me that there is this culture, and I get very frustrated by it, so as you can probably tell. It's going to take quite a change in behaviour and attitude, it seems, within Whitehall. We are, as a government, changing the planning laws on this. We are trying to make it more efficient because we know that there are some very important infrastructure projects that need to get started now. In fact, they should have been started 10 years ago. The airport should have been done, Maplin Sands in the 70s? Yeah, we've been kicking this can around for a long time. It needs to be done. I think this thing will report. I forget the guy from the CBI, Howard, some of these guys running the report. Let's get on with it. Let's just get it built. Let's decide and get on with it because it is so important that we get it right now. I do talk a bit, sir, but unfortunately I'm in an environment in which I'm trying to retain I had a reputation as a GP for having short consultations, that I was efficient with my time, that I never ran over time. but people were broadly content and happy with the service. I've now entered into a world where talking a lot seems to have value. I'm trying to hang on to my efficiency in terms of my communications from the past. I'm making some headway on it, but I think you have to wait until there's a change of the way politics is done at Westminster before you'll get the sort of government that I think you're hoping for. Next question.
My name is Ingrid Harding. I work for the NOMS, Executive Agency, as part of the Ministry of Justice, and I work in an operational role. And I've seen your brochure here that you've deemed it a positive change for a reduction in the civil service to its smallest size since World War II. This action has put me in an inherently dangerous situation with reduced staffing levels. We're required to work to the age of 68 and for reduced pension as reward.
Okay, I mean, in terms of reducing the civil service, indeed, reducing the size of the state, in principle, I absolutely wholeheartedly support that. We are around about 50%, 48% of GDP at the moment as state. We're spending over £700 billion this year. The state's debt, the debt of this country, is doubling under this government. We're doubling it, coalition government. I'm supposed to say to you, we've reduced the deficit by 25%. That's the positive spin. The truth is that we're doubling the debt. So we are on an unsustainable path. With reference to your particular situation, I don't know about your office. And I would hope that where the jobs are being removed are if you allow me, sort of the non-jobs, in inverted commas, that exist, and I certainly have seen these exist in the National Health Service. We're trying to get rid of those, but the jobs that matter should be retained. So in your particular case, if you want to write to me, I can investigate. With reference to pensions, when they introduced the retirement age of 65 in this country, the life expectancy in this country was 68. So the state agreed to underwrite 3 years of retirement. Your life expectancy as a woman is 84 at the moment. It will be more than 84, I would hope, by the time you get there. Okay? That's 6 times the length of retirement that the state originally agreed to. Second thing I would say is that the cost this year for public sector pensions in this country was £32 billion. It's gone up by a third just in the last 10 years. None of this is sustainable. I don't expect to retire at the moment. I can only imagine that we're going to have a retirement age of pushing 75 at some point in the near future. Now, none of this is fair on us. I'm too gallant to ask your age, Adam, but it's not going to, for us, we've been rather shafted as a generation. The people who've done very well out of this, thank you very much, are retired or approaching retirement. The pension system in this country was a Ponzi scheme when it was started. It relied upon, those of you who know what a Ponzi scheme is, it's a pyramid, essentially it's like pyramid selling. It relied upon more people in work paying for people to be retired. So the people in work were paying for the retirement. The others, when they reached retirement, the people beneath them working were paying. i.e. you're not paying for your retirement. Neither did you, neither did you, neither. You didn't pay for your retirement. This is public, I'm not talking private, public. I don't think the general public realised that at the time. So essentially what we've got now is people who are in work are paying for other people to be retired for 25 years, safe in the knowledge they're not going to get to be retired. Well, how does somebody think that's fair? We have realised this, or maybe we should, not me personally, but as a country, we've realised this at the same time as the financial crisis, at the same time when the state was too big. Everything's come at the same time. I personally feel quite strongly about this. I think this intergenerational fairness issue is already coming up on the doorsteps. If you meet any couples who are sort of 40s or younger on the doorstep who are employed in the private sector, they are hopping mad. Because most people around here, bright, educated, employed, joined up the dots, and they've realised that they're getting shafted. And the other thing I would say is that in the past, the public sector, you used to get a better pension because your salary was less. Well, the average salary now in this country for someone in the public sector is £100 a week more than someone in the private sector. So, you know, none of this is either fair or sustainable. Now, the difficulty for someone like me, and indeed my government, is how on earth do you deal with this? How on earth are you know, is it fair to you to cobby you, but also continue to get you to pay tax for someone who's retired, to be retired 25 years and tell you, well, by the way, you only get retired for 15? It's extremely difficult politics. Why are we persisting with winter fuel allowances and free bus passes and free TV licenses? Now, actually, it was in my manifesto. It was in our manifesto at the 2010 election. Personally, I think it was a disgrace. I don't agree with it. Because how can that be fair for people to be continuing to get those benefits, those universal benefits, but people in work who are struggling to make ends meet, both people going out to work to afford to buy a house? And also, let's add in that, less than 5% of the country's property wealth is owned by people under 35. The average age in this country, actually the average age in the country for owning a home, not a house, a home, is 37 now in this country. Now, the people who are a bit older in this room, how old were you when you bought your first home? 20, 21. 27. Okay? It's now 37 and going up. Indeed, in parts of the southeast of England, it's 42. So, okay, you can't buy a home. You're not going to be retired. You're going to pay more and more tax so that other people can have a nice big home. I mean, you try selling that on the doorsteps. So that this is extremely difficult politics because, of course, there are people who are retired who struggle to make ends meet, to heat the house or whatever. Of course there are. But in general terms, there's an intergenerational fairness issue here, which is what you're touching upon. And I think that unless my party, and indeed all political parties, start to take this seriously, you're going to get a breakdown in that social compact that exists in British society, where we want to look after the truly vulnerable. I want people in their 80s and 90s to be safe, to be secure, to be cared for. I want all these things, of course I do. But how do we pay for it when the actual people who are doing the work, paying the tax, can't actually pay enough tax to pay for the other people to have what we've just described? At the same time as have a family, tuition fees, which generations before didn't have to pay. The list goes on, and this is at a time that the nation's debt is doubling in 5 years. 1.6 trillion. If we're lucky, by 2016. 1.6 trillion. We have unsecured debts in this country of over $1 trillion. We have a public sector pension liability on some estimates, it's $3.5 trillion that we can't meet. I mean, the list, sorry, I don't want to depress you too much on a dark, windy night, but it's not good. So in the context, I want to hear about your personal situation in terms of the work situation, because I think that's important, because you do important work. But the broader context of how we pay for pensions, be they public or private, benefits or not, or whatever, all we need a debate, because at the moment we're not in a sustainable position as a society, or anywhere near it. Maybe at the back.
In which case, why is it that we're still paying money into the EU, whose accounts have never been audited?
Yeah, well, because it's, I hope there aren't any francophiles in the room. I mean, the European project is very French in its design, okay? It's very much structured upon a French model. And French politics is, you know, there's some movement between industry and civil service and politicians. And look at Jacques Chirac and the like. I mean, there's a history there. And that is fundamentally the problem. You could argue, actually, that when we didn't turn up in Rome in 1950 to the coal and steel meeting, I think it was 1950, we screwed up there, didn't we? Because if we'd turned up, it might not have been designed in the way that it was. But we are where we are. You make a very fair point, Adam. How can I defend unaudited accounts? How can I defend the fact they want €1 trillion in this latest settlement to spend? How can I defend, I mean, the list goes on. I can't. I'm not culpable. I've only been in Parliament for 2.5 years and I didn't vote in 1975, obviously. So leave it with me. Give me a few years. Sorry, it's time again, so give me a few years and we'll see what we can do.
Dr. Lee, good evening. Will Rainey, you and I have corresponded on a couple of things in the past. As much as anything, it's an observation on what you were saying about how does anybody get the message out in terms of finances. And I was lucky enough to be in New York 6 years ago now, so before the financial crisis, and there was a talk by the guy by the name of David Walker, who was the US Comptroller General. He's the guy who signs off the US government accounts. And he developed a model basically to look at the long-term sustainability of the US economy. And what that demonstrated was that from 2002 onwards, they basically got to a point of inflection where tax revenues went one way and public expenditure went the other way. And he qualified the US accounts, basically because it was in an unsustainable US position, fiscal position. I saw subsequently that he resigned from that role simply because the US government wouldn't give him any publicity in terms of his qualification of those accounts. And it seems to me when you tie that sort of experience to what you're describing, what we actually need is something a little bit braver in the terms you've described here, in terms of getting the message across. And if politicians and the media don't set those harsh facts out, we will carry on assuming that we can carry on living on somebody else's credit card.
Right, okay. I will take the opportunity to perhaps broaden things a bit, but one comment with regards to the US, I mean, is $16 trillion. Putting aside sort of social issues in the US presidential elections, I think they made the wrong decision a couple of weeks ago because ultimately the only issue that matters in America at the moment is its economy, and $16 trillion. I was sort of more convinced by the other guy's ability to deal with that than the current one. Right? And that's putting aside everything else, because I know the rest of Romney's campaign was questionable. But yes, you're right. But actually, at the heart of this is trust. Indeed, it's truth. I had a conversation at my family table on Sunday, over Sunday lunch, and I was asking my grandparents and my parents, so where do you find truth? And it was really interesting, because I didn't know what to say. Because who do you trust now? BBC? Journalists after the tapping scandal? Politicians? So who do you trust? Because the thing is, without trust, and without access to truth, in inverted commas, how on earth can you set about dealing with any of these massive challenges of ageing, of changing climate, instability in the world? I mean, if there's one word to describe the world, you turn on television, it's chaos, really. I mean, if it's not Israel and Palestine and Syria, it's not Syria, it might be Iran, you have Greece, the whole Mediterranean's in turmoil, sub-Saharan Africa, the list goes on. But if you don't have access to truth, and if you don't trust anybody, how on earth can you move forward? Now, I find it quite intriguing how on Monday morning I see 17 patients in SLAP. I think they trust me. They come through my door, they sit down, they tell me what their ailment is. It's a mixed community in Slough, so you get it all. Okay? It's challenging, and they trust me. Sometimes I don't speak their language and they trust me. And yet, I jump in my car and I drive up to Westminster afterwards, and suddenly I become untrustworthy. Why?
Because you switch professions.
But why?
People trust doctors in the main, they trust
Yeah, but I'm being about me personally.
Because you're wearing a different hat or a different person.
But the problem that I encounter is that I try to, as I said at the start of this, is I try to be like I am on a Monday morning for the rest of the week. Now, I'm not completely deluded. I understand that there's been a rich history of suspicion of politicians, and there's a fantastic history of satire, whatever, in this country, and I think that's quite healthy to be sceptical. But when push comes to shove, we've got to get back to a stage where we trust our politicians. Look, I'm not here to defend the actions of expense scandal, my predecessor, whatever, from the past. But that is the past. This is pre-2010. They've changed the system. And yet this week we have dispatches and we have all the other things that happen. Most of it, I might add, was pretty tawdry journalism. But my point is not about whether there were anything wrong with what happened, and I didn't see the programme. But if we continually adopt a cynical approach, where do we get trust from? Because you have to trust people at some point, otherwise nothing will get changed. And so for me, going back to your figures and the fact that I stood here and been honest and said the debt is doubling under this government, something which I'm sure probably if I was reading the Alistair Campbell book of How to Do Politics, I'd be told that that was a bad thing to do. And I was emphasising a negative. What rubbish. You're all intelligent people, you can log on, you can see what the figures are. Why should I not tell you what the figures are myself? Save you the trouble. What I'm trying to do by doing that, though, is in the same way, sir, if you came to me and I had to tell you you had cancer, you expected me not to tell you straight because I'm a politician, or you expected me to tell you straight because I'm a doctor. I'm just who I am. I'm not perfect. I'll make errors, make misjudgments, whatever. That's we're all fallible, we're human beings. But fundamentally, I want people to trust me as a politician as much as they trust me as a doctor. Now that's going to be a pretty tough task, but I think it's important that we trust politicians, because if we're going to deal with trillions of debts, if we're going to deal with Europe, if we're actually going to survive in this world and maintain lifestyles that we've all come to expect, then we need government, which is good government, populated by decent people who make pretty good judgments and who are then consequently trusted by the nation. And look, I mean, I can only but try in my own small way, but I'm saying this because we're in this world now where people looking around for someone to trust and something to trust is becoming increasingly difficult. We used to trust the BBC, and the fact that you've responded like this evening is worrying. You're a pretty educated bunch, and you don't trust the BBC.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
What I think you're saying is absolutely right. And one little bit of correspondence I copied you in on recently, I'm not sure whether you've seen it personally, was my son asked me to give him a bit of background on Northern Rock, because he was doing a paper on it. And I dug around, and I looked at the accounts now of Bad Bank Northern Rock, and I looked at the Public Accounts Committee